Welcome back to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a new video series I created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants under the current administration. This newest episode of Federal Grants Explained is a summary of the changes proposed and that have already happened at the U.S. Department of Education. There's been so much news about this agency that it's hard to keep up, but I was determined to try to make as much sense of it as possible chronologically so that I can try my best to explain it to you, the audience, so that you can follow along. If this is your first time here, my name is Patrice Davis. On this channel, my goal is to shed light on what's happening with federal grant funding under the current administration. That's funding freezes, grant cancellations, agency changes and shutdowns, and how the federal workforce reduction will impact how grants are announced, awarded, and monitored by federal officials. When possible, I'll also feature guests from, former federal employees and other consultants. If this is a topic you find interesting and valuable, please subscribe so you know when the next video is published. In addition to subscribing, please hit that notification bell and share this video with others within your organization or even your professional association who you think will find this information helpful. So, as I always do when I start a new episode, I want to share a little bit about me and why I speak about this topic. I'm a former federal employee and I'm the founder of GrantsWorks Consulting and GrantsWorks Academy. I'm a grant consultant who specializes in federal and other government grants. My team and I have obtained and managed approximately $300 million in federal grants from over 20 federal and other government agencies for over 18 years. And I've developed and delivered training for clients, collaborators, and for federal agency. GrantsWorks is a grant consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal grants. And you should be seeing a little summary about us as I share a little bit more about GrantsWorks. We help our clients identify compliance gaps, manage their grants, monitor and modify award budgets, set up financial management systems, prepare and submit reports, develop required written policies and procedures, become single audit ready, and we help them train their teams. You can learn more about me and GrantsWorks in the video description below. I do want to point out that I will only share information in this video and all future videos that's widely available online. I try to do my best to double check and sometimes even triple check the information because I also want to make sure that nothing that I share in these videos is considered advisory or management consulting. It is informational only. Let's start with the history and an overview of the Department of Education. And going forward, we're just going to call it Education Department. I shared in one of my very first episodes of Federal Grants Explained that the U.S. Department of Education or Education Department was established under the Jimmy Carter administration in 1980, so not that long ago, to win the support of the National Education Association. Yes, the NEA, the largest teachers union. The NEA liked the idea of, creating one federal agency that would handle all things education. And they actually issued their first endorsement of a presidential candidate as a result of Carter's announcement that he would form the U.S. Department of Education. Prior to its creation, there were educational initiatives and program offices in various agencies. For example, there was an Office of Education in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There was also an Office of Economic Opportunity that was later changed to the Office of Child Development in HHS, just in case. And when I say HHS, I'm speaking of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That was where Head Start was initially housed, right? So just want to, give you all some background on some of the programs that kind of have an overlay of health and education. So Head Start was initially housed in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There was also an Office of Education in the U.S. Department of the Interior and in another now defunct agency called the Federal Security Agency. Probably not that important for this episode, but that particular agency, the FSA, was then renamed to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and it had a couple of outshoots from there. According to a professor, Martin West of Harvard University, who specializes in the politics of K-12 education, the education department is the one agency, quote, whose status has been the most tenuous from the inception. He goes on to explain that the establishment of the agency was politically motivated, obviously, and also had the, quote, benefit of consolidating federal education efforts. So, yes, it was politically motivated, but then it also consolidated all the education initiatives and programs across the federal landscape. And so maybe one would see that as a benefit. The agency's key role has been to distribute federal funds, enforce related civil rights laws, and educational research. On the screen, you should be seeing the fiscal year 2024 agency financial report showing the org chart, the organizational chart. And as you can see, there is an Office of Inspector General, like many federal agencies, and that former Office of Inspector General was led by Sandra Bruce under the previous administration. Again, she was the Inspector General for the Education Department, and she is one of the 17 or 18 IGs that were fired by the current president in January 2025. You may remember the first federal employee terminations were 17 to 18 inspector generals. And I may do an episode on inspector generals because I just think that's an interesting topic to explore. But I like to do it sort of in the context of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, because I'd like to explore what the IGs do or did versus what DOGE did, just to kind of understand that. And maybe you all are interested. If you are, drop a comment in the chat and I will try my best to add that to our schedule. So here's the thing I found interesting. Only 10% of K-12 funding comes from the education department, but apparently it's been long believed, according to survey data, that as much as 30% of K-12 funding comes from the federal agency. You should also know that eliminating the U.S. Department of Education was one of President Ronald Reagan's goals when he was elected. So just giving you a little bit of insight into, some of the politics around the creation of the agency, and the fact that it still exists, and why you may, probably shouldn't be surprised that now there is this push to eliminate the agency, now that, conservatives are controlling, all branches of government. And, now they believe they have the mandate to do a lot of the things that they've wanted to do. More information you may find interesting. The two largest funding streams distributed to K-12 education are to provide additional funds to school districts to serve economically disadvantaged students and students with disabilities. It also spends even more on higher education through Pell Grants and the Federal Student Loan Program. Why have people wanted to eliminate the department? I gave you some insight. A lot of it is, of course, politics. There's also some, general, beliefs, obviously, that sort of lead to the political energy behind eliminating the department. But it really comes down to the fact that conservatives believe the federal government should not be involved in what they think should be locally administered funds. And some note that the word education isn't mentioned at all in the Constitution, and therefore they believe the founding fathers had no intention for education to be overseen by the federal government. So just a little bit of insight on why they want to eliminate the agency altogether. One quote I found particularly interesting is that, quote, the American education system is famously and uniquely decentralized, with control over the day-to-day operation of schools in the hands of roughly 14,000 locally elected or appointed school boards. I've always found this very interesting, the way that the American education system is structured. And I've always wondered if that is what has contributed to the U.S.'s typically low, world rankings in the OECD education rankings. And then, of course, I've also wondered if it contributed, and this is not really much to wonder, it clearly contributes to the inconsistency in the curriculum, and, of course, some of the outshoots from that inconsistency. Now let's look at grants awarded to organizations by the Education Department so far in fiscal year 2025. And I also want to take a look at the total awarded in fiscal year 2024 and 2023, just for comparison's sake. To be clear, these numbers do not include Pell Grants that are awarded to individuals. I'm speaking about the block, formula, project grants, and cooperative agreements awarded by the Education Department to various organizations. By the way, cooperative agreements, for those of you who may not be aware, are basically a type of grant. So when I talk about organizations, just to provide a little bit more clarification, I'm speaking about state and local government agencies, universities, nonprofits, businesses, again, not to individuals. So you're going to see on the screen, a summary of grants awarded by the Education Department so far in fiscal year 2025. As a reminder, the federal fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. So we're currently in fiscal year 2025. And so just wanted to kind of make sure you all were aware of that. When we look at the total amount of grants across the 4 types of grants, again, project, block, formula, and cooperative agreements awarded by the Education Department, we see that the states of Texas, California, and New York received the most in 2025. And that's in line with much of federal grants awarded. I mean, they're the most populous states. And so, it makes sense that they would be at the top in many, many instances when we're looking at grants being awarded to state agencies. So to pick back up on the numbers, the Education Department has awarded 3,558 grants totaling $28.7 billion, with the bulk awarded in October of 2024. So before the current administration came in, quite a bit of that was already awarded to grantees. Then there's negative 11.8 million in February. So that, I don't know if those are cancellations, freezes, terminations, rescissions, whatever the term is, but just know that there's a negative 11.8 million in February of 2025. And then it goes positive again, 113.6 million in March, and then 2.8 billion in April. So I'm curious to see the May numbers. The top 5 recipients in fiscal year 2025 so far are the Department of Education of California, and they are, that's their Title I Part A funds. Texas Education Agency, they have 2 Title I Part A grants in the top 5. New York State Education Department, Title I Part A funds again. And then the 5th of the top 5 is the Department of Education of California. There was a state grant that they received. So just wanted to give you all an overview of the grants awarded to date in fiscal year 2025. Now I'm going to switch over to fiscal year 2024, again, primarily for comparison's sake. So grants awarded in fiscal year 2024 from the Education Department to various organizations. According to the government's own database, 22,383 primary grants totaling $54.3 billion was awarded to different entities in all of fiscal year 2024. I do want to clarify for fiscal year 25, 24, and 23 numbers, those numbers, those total number of grants reflect grants that may have been awarded in 2020, in the previous fiscal year, but maybe their year 2 or their year 3 is showing up also in the current fiscal year or whatever fiscal year I'm running the report for. So remember that there are multi-year grants, and so these multi-year grants may show up in the database for the fiscal year that I'm looking at. So the distribution of the top states look the same. California, New York, and Texas leading the pack. And most of the funds awarded in October 2023. In fact, $23.1 billion was awarded in October 2023. Again, that's the first month of fiscal year 2024. It flattened in January and February, and then, of course, picked back up in July 2024 with $21.6 billion awarded. The top 5 recipients were California and Texas's state education agencies, SEAs, and the top 5 grants awarded were Title I Part A funds. Now let's take a look at fiscal year 2023. This is the final year that we're going to look. But again, just wanted to show you so that you can compare or, I have an idea how things may flush out for fiscal year 2025 with, some of the structural changes that we're hearing about at the education department. And when you consider the number of grants that are going to be or have already been terminated, rescinded, canceled, frozen, again, whatever the term is. In fiscal year 2023, the Education Department awarded 25,615 grants, totaling $53.7 billion with with the other fiscal years, most going in this instance to California and Texas, not as much to New York in this particular fiscal year. Again, the bulk was awarded in October 2022, the first month of the fiscal year 2023. 23.3 billion awarded in October 2022. The next big amount again in July 2023 with 21.5 billion. And as I cited previously, the top were Title I Part A funds to California and to Texas. Now we're going to talk about well-known grants from the Education Department. Some of these may sound familiar to you. I'm just going to provide a summary. I won't go into too much detail. I am going to go into Title I funds because it's come up a number of times, and I wanted to help you all as the audience understand what are Title I Part A funds, and is there a Part B, and just provide some more insight into that. So while I was summarizing the total grants by fiscal year, you may remember me noting that Title I Part A funds were the largest grants awarded to organizations, specifically to state governments, right? Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 that was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson and then amended by the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, signed into law by President Obama, is basically the source of or the authorization Title I funding that you keep hearing me mention. Title I Part A funding provides supplemental financial assistance to school districts for children in elementary and secondary education from low-income families, so all children receive a, quote, fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. So that's the purpose for Title I Part A funding. Title I Part A funds are awarded to state education agencies, SEAs, and the SEAs then distribute the funds to local education agencies, or LEAs, which then distribute the funds as subgrants as well, as reallocations to public schools in need. The four types of subgrants, and this is where I kind of nerd out a little bit, are basic grants, concentration grants, targeted grants, and education finance incentive grants. Don't worry, I'm not going to break down the different types of grants. I just wanted to let you know. Of course, that's something I typically would have done, but, we've got to make sure that these videos stay under 45 minutes if possible. In case you're wondering why I keep saying Part A, and if there are other parts, yes, there are other parts to the Every Student Succeeds Act. So Part A is allocations to SEAs, LEAs, and of course the school districts. Part B are state assessments. The purpose is for state assessments. And these are also awarded to state education agencies to cover the costs for the development, administration, and accommodation for different groups of young people, so that they can, various assessments, educational assessments. Part C is to fund programs for the education of migratory children and prevention. Part D is intervention programs for children and youths who are neglected, delinquent, or at risk. Part E is funding to fund flexibility for equitable per pupil funding. And Part F is general provisions of the Every Student Succeeds Act. I should point out here that one of the things that the Every Student Succeeds Act did when it amended the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act is that it reduced federal oversight of education and increased state flexibility in using the funds. So this was something that was in the works. And so what we're experiencing now is obviously a radical speeding up of that process. Other well-known grants awarded to organizations by the Education Department, and this is where the list gets a little long, but bear with me while I go through it. Some of these may sound familiar. I might even cut out some of them. So there's Title II Part A funding, supporting effective instruction state grants, and those are awarded again to SEAs and LEAs to support the recruitment, development, and retention of teachers, principals, and other school leaders. There's Title III, Part A, that's strengthening institution funds. So that's primarily, that's for institutions of higher education. Then there's Title III, Part B, and that is to strengthen HBCUs. And then there's some other programs. Some of these are newer. Some of these are newer. They were authorized by laws signed by, President Biden. So let's go through some of these. So there's the very innovative and groundbreaking full service community schools program that was awarded to 2,000 schools around the country that impacted 1 million students. I haven't heard much about any of these grants being frozen, rescinded, terminated, canceled, paused. But that's something I may kind of look into that on just to fully understand that on my own. Then there's the post-secondary student success grant. There were grants to HBCUs, to, I believe it's called tribally controlled universities, TCCUs, and then other MSIs, minority serving institutions. They also received, millions of dollars in grants to transform their research infrastructure, enhance research productivity, enhance faculty expertise and the physical infrastructure and partnerships. All of those are things that need to be strengthened in order for universities to be able to, compete well for, the billions of dollars in research grants that were awarded by a number of federal agencies, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and many other research arms of agencies. Then there's TRIO Upward Bound. This is one of the 8 TRIO programs. You guys are very familiar with it. Some grant terminations of this funding has already been circulating in the news. The reasons cited by the Education Department for why these grants have been canceled were that they, quote, reflect the prior administration's priorities and policy preferences. They, quote, violate the letter or purpose of federal civil rights law, conflict with the department's policy of prioritizing merit, fairness, and excellence in education, undermine the well-being of the students these programs are intended to help, or constitute an inappropriate use of federal funds. So those are the reasons why the TRIO Upward Bound grants have been terminated, rescinded, canceled, paused, frozen. I have to use all 5 terms because I don't, they're used interchangeably. And other than paused or frozen, I'm just not sure the difference between rescission, cancellation, termination. They all kind of sound the same to me. Then you guys may also be familiar with the Gear Up grants, and that stood for Gaining Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs. Again, just listing some of the grants awarded by the Education Department to state agencies or local education agencies or to nonprofits around the country. Then there's the National Professional Development Program that was $8.4 billion. State Personnel Development Grants Program, $4 million. Teacher Quality Partnership, $70 million. So just a ton of funding that was awarded by that agency to different entities around the country. There's also $2 billion for the Stronger Connections School-Based Mental Health Services and Mental Health Service Professional Demonstration under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And that was awarded to 264 grantees in 48 states. I'm not sure if those grants have been paused, frozen, rescinded, terminated, or canceled. But, just wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that. Fun fact, when I was in college, I used to work for a university in Maryland. And that there was a professor and a physician who started the Center for School Mental Health Services. I think that was the name of the center. His position and his research centered around integrating mental health programs into schools so that young people who typically don't have access to these services were able to achieve or, at least access the services within the schools, considering how much time they spent in schools and the fact that, it'd be easier for mental health professionals to go to the schools to provide the services. The schools could have some oversight of what's happening, so just wanted to provide you some background on that. And, just, this was over 30, this was like 40 years ago. So to see that he'd been working on this was considered kind of novel at the time. And to see that there's this funding that had been put in place, I don't know how long, it's just interesting to kind of connect those dots. So you should also know that the Education Department received $282.5 billion in COVID-19 funding in 2020 and 2021. You guys may remember there was a lot happening with schools. Many students were at home. They didn't have access to laptops or to tablets. There were there were concerns about students not being able to access school lunches because many of them rely on those school lunches to have, a solid meal for the day. There was just so much happening. Teachers needed to adjust to, being able to, educate the children from home. This is a lot going on, but yes, $282.5 billion in COVID-19 funding in 2020 and 2021, specifically funding from the CARES Act, funding from the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriation Act of 2021, and from the I should know this, ARPA. I used to teach about ARPA all the time. American Response, I don't remember what ARPA stands for. I'll drop ARPA in the video description just so you guys are aware of that. But then that funded something called the Education Stabilization Fund. And there are 4 funding programs that came out of that. I won't, bore you guys with that, but many of you who are in the education space will recognize some of these names. There's ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. There's HERE, which is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. There's GEAR, Government's Emergency Education Relief Fund, and the Outlying Areas Bureau of Indian Affairs and Discretionary Grants. So according to the agency's 2024 report, 19.5 billion of, quote, obligated and unobligated COVID-19 funds remain to be dispersed as of September 30th, 2024. I don't know what's happened in October 2024. Maybe they were able to disperse that as a part of the 20 point something billion in October 2024 of last year. You may remember that large 20 something billion dollar amount I mentioned a few minutes ago. But as of September 2024, there was still quite a bit of COVID-19 funding that had not been obligated or had already been obligated. So just wanted to make sure you guys are aware of that. And mostly that was ESSER funding. ESSER, again, stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. As for grants for HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, I recorded this video to highlight just some of the funding that was already awarded or intended for HBCUs under the previous administration. Again, that's just some of the grants. So please watch that video now.
I wanted to quickly review some of the funding that was planned to be awarded to HBCUs and other minority serving institutions as recently as September 2024. Of course, this is something released by the White House. Whenever I see these, I tend to go just strictly to the numbers because the numbers can be verified. So just want to make sure you all know how I approach this. So this is a fact sheet from the Biden-Harris administration that they were announcing 1.3 billion in additional funding and a record of over 17 billion in total support for HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. I do want to point out some details that can easily be fact-checked here. HBCUs provide college access to twice as many Pell Grant eligible low and middle income students. They produce 40% of all Black engineers, 50% of Black teachers, 70% of all Black doctors and dentists, 80% of all Black judges, and the first Black American and first woman to be vice president of the U.S., Vice President Kamala Harris. And so one of the reasons why HBCUs typically are funded is that specific information, that they tend to be the institutions that basically support Black upward mobility. I do also want to take a look at the actual numbers. We're talking about funding awarded by the U.S. Department of Education. So I thought I would take a look at that. According to information that's on this website, and I'm surprised it's still up, actually, is that, again, there's an additional 1.3 billion in federal investments announced today. That was in September of 2024. That's 188 million in competitive grants to HBCUs through the Department of Education, including grants that will support R&D, research and development capacity building, 1.1 billion in funding to support students at HBCUs directly through need-based grants and other federal programs, including Pell Grants. And then there's, of course, the other agencies. Department of Defense, U.S. Air Force established the first ever HBCU-led university-affiliated Research Center, which was led by Howard University. U.S. Department of Commerce, National Telecommunications and Information Administration established first ever Connecting Minority Communities program. The Department of Commerce, Chips for America, hosted the launch of the HBCU Chips Network, a collaboration of several university HBCUs and Georgia Tech. It goes on. I just want you all to see the information for yourselves. A lot of times this information is released and we get caught up in the numbers, not realizing the impact that some of these awards were having or would have had on the ground. And many of these grants were probably or have already been canceled. So this is, of course, again, the U.S. Department of Commerce, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 4.2 million to HBCUs through the MSI Cooperative Science Center program. Again, Department of Agriculture, 262 million investment to support 33 projects across multiple U.S. institutions of higher ed. And then, of course, they had a next gen program. So I'll keep going. Department of Education, the Department of Energy, 7.75 million for the Clean Energy Education Prize, another 25 million to HBCUs under the research. We talked about that research and development infrastructure program again. So just wanted to show you all some of these numbers. Department of Education, 2.3 million in new grant awards for the Minority Science and Engineering Improvement Program. So clearly there was investments being made. The U.S. Department of Education again announced nearly 15 million in new grants under the Augustus F. Hawkins Centers of Excellence. And it goes on. It goes on. But I just wanted you all to see these investments, specifically in HBCUs. I would love to learn a little bit more about grants that were awarded to other institutions, such as what are called minority serving institutions or tribally controlled. I believe, I forgot what that second C is, TCCUs. So just wanted to share this information with you as a little drop in as we were talking about grants from the Education Department and what will be changing or has already changed in 2025.
Okay, now that you've seen the video, you can't help but, wonder what might have been, right? So now we'll take a look at how the agency has changed and will change in 2025 and beyond. So we're going to focus now on agency restructuring. In March of 2025, a reduction in force or RIF impacting all departments with a goal to terminate 50% of the Education Department staff was announced, with many proposed to be placed on leave effective March 21st, 2025. I was really surprised to hear that. I remember hearing it in the news, but I did not understand that they were trying to do it that quickly. So for more context, I think it's always important to add a little bit of context by just, it just helps a lot. According to the Education Department's website, there were 4,133 employees at the Education Department at the start of this administration. Almost 600 of them accepted the voluntary resignation opportunities that were offered to all federal employees, in the beginning of the year, or I guess around February or March or so. And those two, and so again, almost 600 accepted the two that were offered. But the RIF is apparently still up in the air. The Education Department has not been able to, terminate 50% of their staff as they planned. As I was preparing for this episode on June 4th, 2025, and I'm recording this on June 5th, 2025, it was announced that the first U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston declined the administration's effort to move forward with the RIF, but the administration, as you know, could ask the Supreme Court to lift the order. And I believe the Justice Department wanted the court to make a decision ASAP because the plan, of course, is to take it to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to weigh in. The lawsuits, plural, were filed by the lawsuits against the Education Department were filed by 21 states, 5 labor organizations, and 2 school districts that allege the RIF violates the Constitution and Administrative Procedures Act. You're going to hear a lot about Administrative Procedure Act. You're going to hear a lot about that. And I've shared in other webinars or other trainings a little bit about the Administrative Procedure Act and why there's so many lawsuits for some of the things that the president has declared in the executive orders that have been released. So as for its Office of Civil Rights, it's heavily involved in the department's pursuit of universities that it believes are not meeting federal standards to protect Jewish students from harassment. And the education department has cut or proposed cut to funding of federal grants, federal contracts from a number of universities, including Columbia University, Brown, and up to 58 others. And unless you've been under a rock, I'm sure you've heard of the very, very public battle between the administration and Harvard University, with the administration first proposing to cut about $2.2 billion in grants and contracts, then threatening to take away the Harvard University's nonprofit status, then removing or threatening to remove its ability to recruit international students, and more drama. I won't go into it in this episode. I've done 2 episodes on this debacle, and I'll link those in the video description below. Now we're going to talk a little bit about impact on federal grants or federal grantees. One of the first press releases, it's probably the 5th, but one of the first few press releases about cuts was released on February 17th, 2025 with the title, U.S. Department of Education cuts over 600 million divisive teacher training grants. That was the title of the press release. It goes on to note that training materials included, quote, inappropriate and unnecessary topics such as critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, better known as DEI, anti-racism, and white privilege. To support their decision, they cited the program descriptions from grant applications, literally applications. So, of course, anyone can submit an application, but they wanted to cite the applications, and I wish they'd actually cited the funded programs, but they cited some of the applications because some of the titles of the applications supported in their minds, supported the reasons why the teacher, what they call divisive teacher training grants. In early April, the Supreme Court upheld the agency's decision to cut those specific grants. So that's $600 million in teacher training grants gone. Other grants cut include the Comprehensive Centers Program. That's 18 grants canceled, totaling $226 million, awarded to a network of regional and national centers that were created to provide scalable, quote, capacity building services to states and systems within their regions. The Education Department cited, quote, radical agendas being forced onto states and systems as the reason for the cancellations. Then there's the Equity Assistance Centers grants and contracts, over $350 million, were canceled on February 13th, 2025. They were described as, quote, woke spending. This has resulted in a lawsuit from the Legal Defense Fund in defense of the NAACP and Mid-Atlanta Equity Consortium, or maybe the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium Incorporated. This cancellation led to what seems to be other legal challenges, one that resulted, in fact, in the Southern Education Foundation's grant being temporarily reinstated to comply with a May 21st court order. So there's a lot happening, a lot of legal actions, a lot of cancellations, a lot of restructuring. So, I'm hoping this is helping you understand all of the activity, all of the energy being focused on scaling back the education department and the funding from the education department. So, my head is hurting even as I was preparing this yesterday. And of course, reading all of this because it's a lot of information to try to keep a track of. But the Education Department also apparently plans to discontinue $1 billion in federal grants for school mental health programs. As I mentioned earlier, these grants were part of the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed after the aftermath of the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Grants that are aligned with DEI, of course, are being terminated, as I mentioned earlier. One example is the Teacher and School Leader Grant that 29 school districts used to fill literacy positions, retain effective teachers, address learning gaps, and narrow achievement gaps. Then there's the Ready to Learn grant that funds PBS children's shows That's been terminated. I'm not sure what the status is. I learned about this several weeks ago. So I'm not sure if any, some of the things that I may have shared that have been terminated or canceled, rescinded, paused, or frozen. I'm not sure if there's some other legal action that I'm unaware of. But I do want to at least let you know what's been targeted, and where possible, I'll let you know if there's legal action to reinstate the grants or push back on the education department's efforts to terminate these grants. But the Ready to Learn grant was a $23 million grant. And as I mentioned earlier, TRIO Upward Bound grants to some community colleges have been canceled. So I described to you those TRIO grants earlier. Again, TRIO Upward Bound is one of 8 types of TRIO grants, but they've been canceled. And the reason cited by the education department is that they are, quote, relics of the past. There are more reasons, I'm sure, but that was one of the reasons that stood out. So again, the attempted and actual cancellations and the various lawsuits are dizzying. So it turns out choosing the education department as the first agency to feature was probably not the best choice, but I learned a lot, and hopefully you did too. So now we're going to talk, as we're winding down this episode, about what's being preserved or prioritized. So just as I did with the last episode, I'll list some of the grant programs that will either be created, retained, or that will have an increase in funding based on the current administration's priorities, including what's been featured in the One Big Beautiful Bill that is making its way. And here's a short list, but something just for you all to get an idea. And you may have heard some of this as well. They are definitely prioritizing funding for charter schools. So they do plan on allocating $60 million in new funding for charter school grants. They want to definitely preserve Title I funding. As I mentioned before, we've talked about what Title I funding is and all the various parts, but they do plan on eliminating funding for Part C for migrant children. They do plan to preserve IDEA Part B grants for students with disabilities, and I forget what IDEA stands for. They do plan to preserve IDEA Part C funding, special education for infants and toddlers with disabilities, and they do plan actually also to consolidate IDEA's 6 funding streams into one that will flow to the state. So, if they're going to consolidate and streamline something, I'm all for that. What the terms of the funding are going to be now that they're consolidated, the requirements, the monitoring, there's so much. I mean, it sounds good on the surface. Yes, consolidate them and put them into one. But as a federal grant compliance consultant, of course, I'd want to dig a little bit further to find out what the state's responsibilities are going to be. Now, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the grant management needs of states are going to definitely increase because, if you're going to be sending all of this funding to states and sort of placing the responsibility on them in some ways, that's just something to consider and something that we've been thinking a lot about. So for this episode, I was also going to go even deeper into the plan for the education department in the One Big Beautiful Bill. But because changes are possible, I tend to not focus on funding bills until they're signed. To me, it just doesn't, it just adds to the, changing information. So I want to see it once it's been signed. I know a lot of organizations follow it because they want to be able to, for advocacy purposes. I definitely want to find out what's happening because I'm paying attention to certain funding streams for our clients. But again, as a federal grant compliance specialist, I tend to follow funding bills for awareness, but I really, really focus once it becomes the law, if that's been signed by the president, and of course on the grants themselves once they're released as funding opportunities by the federal agencies, and certainly once they're awarded to grantees. All right. I think I'll leave this episode about the education department here. I intended, as usual, on a short overview. But as usual, this ended up being much longer than planned. One agency, and I know this is different, but I did want to bring this up. One agency I haven't covered is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I've managed HUD grants, but I haven't been really keeping track of what's been happening to HUD, all the restructuring, all, some of the grants that are going to be either reduced or terminated altogether, or even the sub agencies or departments or divisions within HUD that may be at risk. That's something I really want to pay attention to, and here's why. It seems that the grants that fund senior and other low-income housing are up in the air. I'm aware of at least one instance. And so I'm very curious to find out what's happening with those grants. And I definitely plan to learn more and share what I've learned with you for an upcoming episode. So that's the end of this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Again, if you found this video valuable, please do 3 things. Press the like button, subscribe, and share it as far and wide as possible. The last time I checked, we were about 4 subscriptions shy of 100. So if you can get us over that 100 subscribers mark, that would be fantastic. In fact, if you really like this, go ahead and subscribe. Maybe get us to 200. That will be fantastic. If there's a particular topic you'd like me to cover, or something you'd like to add that I didn't cover, or even something I misreported, please drop it in the comments. I read those comments and I respond. I also would love for you to check out the links in the video description below to learn about GrantsWorks and GrantsWorks Academy, including the Federal Grant Funding and Management Training Series. As a reminder, this training helps you better understand federal grants, especially with everything that's happening. Understanding federal grants, if you are a federal grantee, is a no-brainer. You want to understand how they're awarded, about some of the systems used by federal grantees, about grantees' audit requirements, reporting, record retention, monitoring, and budgetary responsibilities. All of that is covered in the Federal Grant Funding and Management Training Series. I also linked to some of the resources and articles I used to prepare for this episode, so you can check them out for yourself. And again, if there's anything I misreported, please drop them in the comments. If you like this episode, drop that in the comments. But I do want to thank you again for spending some time to learn about how grants are changing from the education department. Again, I'm Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next video, goodbye.